I would like to introduce Len Edwards, who is the chair of the panel. He's almost held as many deputy ministerships as Peter Harder. He was the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Deputy Minister of International Trade, the Deputy Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. He's held important positions in Asia as ambassador to China and to Korea. He's currently a strategic advisor at Gowling, Lafleur Henderson. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, David, for that introduction. I was ambassador to Japan, actually, not China. I don't want to I could be in real trouble if I don't clarify that. Well, good morning, everybody, and it's a real pleasure to be here and to have share the stage with some very distinguished panelists. Well, it's no accident that the second panel should really be on the energy sector. The enormous growth in demand in China, driven by its own enormous growth, has created a real transformation of the global energy market. And lots of people have written about it, and it goes without saying then that what we're faced with is really a transformational moment in terms of world energy markets. China is the world's largest energy consumer, the second largest oil consumer after the United States, represented about 1/2 of oil demand growth in the decade in the decade to 2010. In researching a bit for this, I saw that McKinsey, I think this came out in the CCCE's set of documents, John, and that is that China will represent 26% of the global oil and gas market in 2020, which is up from 17% in 2009, and in 2020, 28% of the energy market overall, which gives you a sense of the scale we're talking about. Well, Canada and China stand to be long-term partners in this field. There is enormous upside potential for a closely integrated partnership involving trade, investment, technology flows, and services. And the question is really, and that's the question for this panel, is can we get there? I was noticing that export trade statistics for last year show, as you might expect, that coal is Canada's largest fuel export to China, and that it itself grew by 87% in value over 2012. But crude oil is also in the mix. It makes up 20% of our fuel exports and growing by 7% in value in 2012. So it's not as if we're absent from the market in crude, but it's a very, very small amount. Still, overall, fuel exports were the 4th largest harmonized system category of exports to China, and totaled just over $2 billion in 2012. Well, that's a bit of the background, but you can see that against what I said about the Chinese growth and its dominance of the world energy market going forward, that much, much more is possible. For one thing, nuclear exports, fuel exports, should add to the totals as the new nuclear cooperation agreement comes into effect and permits uranium exports from Canada to China. But it's really in the domain of petroleum products where most of the growth should occur, and indeed cross-Pacific trade in these products is virtually non-existent. That's the trade picture. The investment picture, of course, is also very lively, as we've seen over the last year, and we're very pleased to have the Vice President of CNOOC with us, because the $15.1 billion acquisition of Nexen was the big news item, and has probably the biggest news item in a decade, of course, in terms of Chinese investments in Canada. It was approved last December by the government. But what is the outlook going forward? And what is the potential for engagement by Canadian firms going the other way? So this panel is going to spend most of its time looking at what the opportunities are, what must be done to realize the potential in the oil and gas sector in particular. So we have today 4 individuals to help us do this. Again, the bios are in in the package. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but Madeleine Drohan is an award-winning author and journalist. She's currently the Canada correspondent for The Economist magazine, contributes regularly to its sister company, The Economist Intelligence Unit. And I should say, perhaps, Madeleine, that last fall you did a report for the CIC entitled The 9 Habits of Highly Effective Resource Economies, Lessons for Canada, to which I'm sure she'll refer today. I already mentioned Mr. Fang Ji. I was chairman of CNOOC Canada Limited, but he's listed in the program as the vice president of CNOOC. When I look at all of the positions you hold within the organization, it's hard to tell which one to refer you to because you seem to hold a lot. You're also the head of the Foreign Affairs Bureau in CNOOC, but I think the important thing to do is to warmly welcome you here to this panel. You will be the Chinese voice on the panel, and I'll be putting you on the spot a tiny bit, but not a lot. Hugh Stevens. Hugh Stevens is a former colleague of mine from Foreign Affairs days going back. We actually served in a posting together. Well, he has more than 35 years of government and business experience in the Asia-Pacific region. Before returning to Canada 3 years ago, he was Senior Vice President, Public Policy, Asia-Pacific for Time Warner, and he was based in Hong Kong, and he still serves as an advisor there. As I said, he spent a long career in the Foreign Service that preceded that. And finally, Greg Stringham. Many of you know him. He's Vice President, Markets and Fiscal Policy at the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. Brings a broad experience in the energy sector and includes some time prior to joining CAP with the Alberta Department of Energy, and before that he worked with Syncrude Canada. So that's your panel, ladies and gentlemen. Now, what we're going to do is focus, at least initially anyway, on 3 general questions, which the organizers of the conference felt were really the areas we needed to probe, at least initially, until we get a chance to hear from you, and maybe you'll want to probe them a little further. But sort of 3 general questions. The first one has to do with the supply capacity. What are the challenges in exporting oil and natural gas to China? This has to do with the partnerships at home, the trans-Pacific delivery, the infrastructure issues, and so on. And I'm going to turn to Greg in a second to start that off. We're then going to look a bit at the investment picture. And here, I think really it comes down to in the wake of the Nexon decision and policy going forward. How can Canada best manage cooperation with Chinese state-owned enterprises? This is a bit of has been a controversial issue. It will continue to be an extremely important issue for Canada, both government and industry to wrestle with, but also Chinese investors. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about the overall relationship in the sector and how we can make it mutually beneficial all around. So to start things off, Greg, I'm going to start with you. Maybe you'd give us some of your perspectives then on sort of what are the challenges in exporting oil and gas to China, from building the necessary partnerships to enabling reliable trans-Pacific delivery, meeting the goals of sustainable resource use.
Sure, Len. Well, thank you. I think I want to thank the organizers for inviting us to be here. I mean, clearly this is an important part of our energy sector's plan going forward. And the way we look at this relationship is really built on the 4 pillars that have already been discussed a bit today, but the infrastructure fits right into that. Those 4 pillars for us are the relationships that everyone has been talking about here, and I think that's critical when it comes to Canada-China relationships. The infrastructure is the second pillar that we focus on, and I'll speak to that in just a second. The third, of course, is the investment side of it, and we're going to be discussing that as a panel. And the fourth one that came up on the earlier panel that's really critical for our industry is that of technology, particularly in the environmental sphere. And so in that context, let me come back and talk a little about this infrastructure challenge that we have in trying to develop that 4-pronged relationship between Canada and China in energy. Now, I represent oil and gas, and I know that there's more. There's nuclear, there's renewables, and others in that energy sphere. But in focusing on the oil and gas, just to give you some context of why this is so important to us, our industry in Canada, as you well know, is in a really very sudden change and dramatic restructuring because we've been so focused on meeting our own Canadian needs, and in particular in the North American context, for the last several decades. And this has really been changed with the advent of a significant new source of natural gas that's coming in the US. And now we see, even in Canada and the US, a new source of conventional tight oil, as it's called, coming, that has caused the industry over the last 5 or 6 years to look beyond the borders of just North America. That still requires us to be very prudent in this area, but as we look now to expand beyond these borders, the question of infrastructure becomes a very critical one for us. And as we start looking at across what's happening, we look at kind of 3 main areas of infrastructure development. Of course, we're still continuing to serve the needs of Canadians, and even in kind of Quebec and Atlantic Canada on the oil side is still continuing to import a significant amount of oil, there's an opportunity there to be able to extend our market and move into that area. But as we look at the United States and other markets, the one interesting context piece for this infrastructure is that right now in Canada we produce about 3 million barrels a day of oil. That places us about number 6 in the world as far as the largest oil producers. But we see that growing over the next decade or two to about 6 million barrels a day, so almost doubling. But let me put it in context from that perspective. If you look at the US market now, because of the net imports and the increase that is coming from their own domestic supply, they're expected to drop by about 3 million barrels a day. And yet we look to the Chinese market, and the Chinese market over that same period is expected to grow by at least 3 million barrels a day. It's not just an oil story, though. I think the real critical one as we look to Asia as a whole, but in particular with some environmental aspects into China, is the whole question of natural gas. We in Canada today produce about 14 billion cubic feet of natural gas. But the expectation of growth in the liquefied natural gas market in China is over 10 billion cubic feet a day in the next 10 years. So clearly we're not going to supply all of that market, but even to be part of that market, we're going to need the infrastructure to be able to do that. And the infrastructure that's being looked at, of course, is all looking to our west coast, although our colleagues to the south in the United States are also looking at the opportunities of exporting out of their west coast, out of their southern coast and around through the expanded Panama Canal and potentially into China as well. And so it's not like we're on a sole playing field here. We are in competitive business to be able to try and attract that business, but it does require us to look at the infrastructure. The opportunities are big, the challenges are equally so as we start looking at new infrastructure. Clearly, as we found in any of the developments that we all develop in any manufacturing, in any kind of business, the existing infrastructure is one that's there and in place and relatively well understood. Expansions of existing infrastructure, so expansions of pipelines, twinning of them, increasing their capacity, do have some concerns, but they're not as big of an issue that comes out as do the brand new build of new infrastructure. And whether it be new producing plants, whether it be new pipelines, whether it be new rail facilities, or even new ship terminals, all of those do require a great deal of environmental and regulatory review, but also public dialogue as they now look at the opportunity to be able to have input on new facilities. So as we look to the opportunities for infrastructure in the West Coast, I would say the biggest challenges for us is to make sure that we maximize on the existing infrastructure. As Len mentioned, we are exporting some oil right now. The pipeline that goes down through Vancouver does have a port facility of about 50,000 barrels a day. Very small amount if we look at 3 million barrels a day of opportunity. There are proposals that are out there to look at pipelines to the north and pipelines down to expand that pipeline through Vancouver. And there are about 10 different liquefied natural gas facilities that have been proposed for the west coast of Canada. This even has some comment, as was mentioned on the earlier panel, with respect to the United States. As they look around at their opportunities right now, the legislation does not allow them to export their oil or export their natural gas because they have been net consumers for many, many decades. It provides Canada an opportunity to use our infrastructure to become that link from North America, not just Canada, of resources that we have in the North American that are now becoming very abundant to the growing demand we see in China and elsewhere.
Thanks, Greg. Mr. Fang, at the receiving end, China is obviously looking for sources of supply going forward to meet the vast demand increase that Greg's referred to. To what extent do you see Canada filling that role, bearing in mind you probably have other choices as well?
Well, thank you, Len. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizer for inviting me. And in addition to that, I would like to start by saying that CNOOC Limited is a publicly traded company in New York and Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Our mandate is to deliver value to our shareholders. Therefore, as a commercial organization, we typically would pursue the highest price for our products in the open market. But we do realize that there is a need back at home for energy security as well as diversification, which is, of course, also part of the security. And Canada could potentially be a source, supply source of energy, especially the petroleum products. Therefore, on the receiving end, we very much look at Canada the way as a potentially stable source of supply. Whereas, on the other hand, we are a member of CAP, meaning we are the producers, one of the producers in Canada. Mm-hmm. And being the producer, we very much would like to get rid of the discount in price that we are all suffering, essentially. So the concept really is you need a diversified routes to export or to move your molecules to the market. But it is the Canadians in general who own those resources. And you have got to decide which way to move those molecules to serve the best, your best interest. We would only be able to examine the business merit of your choice, and hopefully we will be greatly participating in those endeavors.
Well, thank you. I guess one thing that comes out of all of this is, and what one hears a lot of, is that we have a window of opportunity to provide you and your company, who's now invested in Canada, an opportunity to get a better price for your product, and to supply China at the same time. And Greg, we hear, of course, that this window of opportunity is fairly short. Do you have any sense of how quickly Canada is going to have to act to get the infrastructure in place, to really take full advantage of the price differentials that exist, the early stage that China is at in terms of acquiring a long-term source of supply from various places, not just Canada?
The short answer to that is faster than we have. The real answer is when we start looking at the liquefied natural gas market in particular, that's probably where the window is the tightest, because natural gas is abundant around the world. And so Canada's opportunity for that, and the discussions that are going on policy in the US, will have an impact on what North America plays in that global market. And that's a significant shift. Natural gas has really been very North American ever since its discovery 50 years ago. And so moving into that North American, beyond the North American market, is one where we do have that window of opportunity. But there, I think the regulatory systems and the timing and the things that go along that have been very efficient. And so the permits are in place, the approvals are all there. It's really now down to the commercial arrangements that need to be made to be able to have that happen. The question on the oil side of things is a little different, because the oil market is, in North America, changing as we speak. This discovery and production of tight oil that has come on so quickly is really one that has changed the focus. And so that's why I think we've had kind of international interest in Canada for many years. We had first a good relationship with Canada and the US and a lot of investment that came in. And then we saw a lot of the European countries, early 2000s, starting to come in and make investments here, including some of their state-owned companies like Statoil and others that came from other countries. And now we've seen a very strong interest from Asia. In fact, as was mentioned on the earlier panel, I mean, over the last 3 years in our energy business alone, we've seen $45 billion of investment come from Asia, of which $30 billion came from China alone, of which $15 billion is the one transaction that happened last year. And so from that perspective, people go, well, that's very big and that's large, and is there something to be worried about there? But I put it in the context of saying, you've got to recognize that our resource development in Canada requires a great deal of capital, more than we can supply here. So we spend about, in capital investment, $62 billion this year. And just this year, and that will continue on. We require that international and global attention in order to have the development here for the jobs and the resources that end up staying here. But so that window of opportunity for oil is a bit longer, but the challenges are significant as well in ensuring that. It was an interesting anecdote when I was in China talking to the companies about this and the patience that they are exercising to try and see how long this takes. The question was, well, we're looking at where the refining of this oil might happen. Is there something that could happen in Canada versus the United States? And they said, in Canada versus China. And the comment I got back is, well, you don't need to worry much about that because we can actually build a refinery quicker than you can build a pipeline. And so we need to actually move to try and remedy that by making sure that we have the public acceptance, which is the big part of it, the regulatory approvals, which the governments have moved on, but then also just the commercial deals in order to actually make that happen.
Mr. Fang, I'm not asking you to comment from CNOOC's point of view, but as an oil industry executive, Chinese oil industry executive, where do you feel the time pressures are for us? You have other sources that you can go to. And when you talk about gas, for example, I saw something the other day. I was in Australia, actually, and there was an article I saw written in the East Asia Forum, that an Australian publication, by Fateh Birol of the International Energy Agency. And he said that Australia is going to have a windfall in terms of gas demand in China, and could replace Qatar as the prime supplier by 2035, and we'll see 3 times the growth in LNG exports to China between now and 2035. So I guess my question has to do with competition. Does the future of the energy relationship with China, between China and Canada, to what extent is it put at risk by competitors out there such as Australia? Could I ask you to comment on that, Stefan?
Well, that's a very interesting question. But let's try not just think your market, China as your only market. If you look across the Pacific, there are India, there are China, even Japan, with all its troubles with nuclear power. But essentially, we are looking at a trend whereby some 3 billion people is striving for industrialization. And by definition, the consumption per capita for petroleum products in that part of the world, in the developing nations, is less than 5 barrels per capita. Whereas in North America, the per capita consumption is 15 barrels. 15 barrels. Therefore, the market potential across the Pacific is very substantial. You probably do not really have to worry about the demand growth. I would rather say that as a whole, this industry has to help on the other front, and that is energy conservation. If the world would be a lot more efficient if you have a modernized society well, your per capita petroleum product consumption could be lowered by 1/3. Let's say a developed society with 10 barrels per capita consumption, wouldn't that be a much better world? So from my perspective, I think that is overall the policy of reducing emission and striving for energy consumption that is taking place in China nowadays is really about. And you've got to look at those markets in both ways. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Greg, you talked a bit about investment and so forth, so maybe we could move on to the next big question that we have to consider, and that is in the wake of the Nexon decision and policy going forward, how can Canada best manage? I'm going to turn to Hugh to start this one off. So what are the major issues facing Chinese companies wanting to invest in Canada from your perspective?
Well, Len, as you say, obviously, and as Greg has pointed out, investment is going to be essential for the industry to move forward. But if we look at the long drawn-out Nexon case and what happens beyond Nexon, it's not overstating it. It's perhaps in the realm of the obvious that this was a controversial decision. And why was it a controversial decision? Frankly, I think it's fair to say that Chinese companies, particularly Chinese SOEs coming into this market, have a reputation and an image issue that they have to manage. This may be fair or unfair, but frankly, it's the reality. If we're going to deal with these sorts of issues, you have to identify them and figure out how you get around those issues and how you deal with them. Where does this come from? I mean, frankly, it comes from the recent history and the rise of China. It comes from media coverage. I think it's probably fair to say that the average Canadian is not terribly well informed about China, but nonetheless has some fairly strong views that have been formed through media, through other perceptions. So if we look at some of the polling, for example, the China Institute did some polling on Albertans' view of Chinese investment, and there was a strong consensus that Alberta needed to develop further energy relationships with China. But when it talked about the degree of, did you agree or disagree as to whether Chinese companies should have majority control in Alberta, 64% disagreed. When they talked about are you in favor or not in favor of Chinese SOE investment, a small majority, 53%, disagreed. So more than half people were against. The Asia Pacific Foundation did a survey last April asking a number of questions about Asia, but one of them was on SOE investment, not necessarily in the energy issue, in the energy patch, but talked about SOE investment from various countries. Now, 75% of respondents were against or disagreed that this would be good for Canada. I have to say that generally there was not a huge enthusiasm for SOE investment from any country, but China was one of the highest. So we have this sort of general sense. I should also point out that the foundation did a more specific study on Canadians focused in Asia, and there was a majority view of the desirability of Chinese investment. And so we have different views, and probably, as somebody has said earlier, the views of people in this room would not be the same as the general public. So that's kind of the backdrop. And so you say to yourself, well, why is it? Why does this come about? And there are a variety of reasons. One is, frankly, the growth of China, the large trade surpluses that it's developing, and the kind of coverage that gets. And I thought it might be useful to cite one very specific example. It's just a microcosm, but it does show how Chinese investment can polarize the situation. I'm living in British Columbia. This particular issue, the so-called Chinese miners case in British Columbia, is a big deal. It's a coal mining operation, so it's in the energy sector, and it involves a company by the name of HD Mining that wanted to bring in 200 temporary workers, 200 Chinese miners, to develop a coal mine in Tumbler Ridge. Well, 200 miners is not a huge amount of temporary workers. There are about 400,000 temporary workers in Canada at the present time. Tim Hortons alone employs 14,000 temporary workers, 11,000 of whom come from the Philippines. You don't hear a huge groundswell. I mean, you hear comments about the number of temporary workers and how do we get Canadians to fill those jobs and so forth. But it's very interesting that the Chinese miners case was all about a Chinese company bringing in Chinese miners and potentially imposing laxer Chinese mining standards and so forth. And the issue is they ran into the union movement. And the various unions that were engaged in this argued that, how come you couldn't find any Canadian miners? And frankly, I think the company perhaps didn't do a great job. But we have to recognize complicity here on the part of the federal and provincial governments and encourage them to go ahead. In any event, this really hit the media. The United Steelworkers did a whole study about the company that was behind this. And of course, their contention was this company is a state-owned company, as if this is going to send shivers through everybody's, down everybody's backbone. And because it's a state-owned company, and they talked about the accumulation of wealth in China, and they talked about Chinese going out to gather resources and so forth, it gave very much the impression that this was a Chinese plot. And I just wanted to actually read one line from their report, which I think illustrates very well the image and reputational issues that need to be dealt with in a responsible way. British Columbians and Canadians should consider whether the financial might and industrial power of the Chinese state might lie behind projects such as these northeastern coal mines. So this isn't really about investment. This is about how, frankly, it's about fear and mistrust. What I might even call sinophobia. And the definition of phobia is irrational fear. So the issue is there fear? The answer is yes. Is it irrational? Is it irrational? Well, I would argue that it's irrational. I mean, Mr. Fong talked about the motivation of CNOOC, a publicly listed company driven by profitability, et cetera. We also have to recognize that we are a sovereign jurisdiction. If there are issues, these state-owned companies are big companies. They're not cuddly little teddy bears or panda bears. They're big companies. They have to be dealt with as any other big company would do. And we have the means to do that. We have competition laws, we have environmental laws, we have labor laws, health and safety laws, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And frankly, that's what all companies, but particularly Chinese companies, because I do really feel that the bar is almost higher for them than for anybody else, will have to meet. I think it's incumbent upon governments who want this investment to assist them to get over this bar, but the companies themselves have to do some good homework, some good community relations, some good media relations to ensure that they are seen as operating as good local citizens, which I feel they can be. But this is, frankly, a big issue that's out there. And if we want to have more investment, we're going to have to figure out ways to deal with it in a responsible way.
Thanks, Hugh. I think you really did outline the issues in a very stark way. I'm not going to ask Mr. Fong just yet to comment. In fact, it's probably a little awkward for you to comment on these matters. I'm going to come back to the general question, a general question on that, so we get away from CNOOC as the example. But before I do, Madeleine, I was wondering, on the basis of some of the work you've done on the resource sector, how do you think that in the light of what we saw around the Nixon decision and the whole issue of SOE investment generally, and the investment climate going forward, how should Canadian governments manage this issue to get to make sure that we are using our resources in Canadian interests, but at the same time recognize that we need foreign investment in Canada?
Well, I'll just pick up on actually something that Hugh was talking about there, because although I agree that China was set up as the boogeyman in the particular public discussion about that, I think there's something else that's at play there as well, and that's that there's a lot of public uncertainty about resources and natural resource sales. How much is for sale? Is everything for sale? Is nothing for sale? When you put it in the context where we had 2006-07, we had a lot of the major mining companies being sold. So the CNOOC bid for Nixon came in that context. And it's not clear, it was actually with the government's response to it, there was a limit that was hinted at where the government said, well, this will be the last particular sale to a state-owned enterprise in the oil sands. And I can't remember the wording exactly, but it was something like, we're getting close to the limit. Well, I think that was news to a lot of people. You know, what's the limit? Where did that limit come from? You know, did that number come out of the air? And it comes down to a broader issue, which is Canada's natural resource policy, and this touches on infrastructure and investment, and that has been pretty ad hoc over the years. It's been ad hoc, it's partly because it's worked. You know, we built a big, successful society, but so many of the speakers today have talked about a transformational moment, and yet how are we reacting? How is Canada reacting to the transformational moment? Is it just business as usual? I mean, it would seem that if everything's changing, then perhaps our approach to resource policy and energy policy in general should also be changing. When I looked, as part of the research I did for the CIC report, I was looking at other resource producers around the world, and the ones, many of them that have very successful resource sectors are much more deliberate than Canada is about tying together their policies, trying to put together holistic policies, trying to address problems before they actually come up. This is not industrial policy per se, but it's the word used is deliberate. You know, you had to think it through. And this ties in with something that Greg's talking about on the infrastructure front. And I think the Northern Gateway pipeline and the problems that it's facing right now are a perfect example of a lack of sort of a holistic policy for resources. We've known about the environmental movement since the 70s. We've known about issues with Aboriginal communities for just as long. And yet there hasn't been an attempt to sort of address those issues and tie them together. And so it isn't really much of a surprise that the Northern Gateway pipeline is running into difficulties now. And just one final thing, I think it would make it easier for our partners like China to deal with us if we were a bit more upfront and thoughtful about what our policies were, and then they'd know what they were working with. I think I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Thanks, Madeleine. You're expanding the discussion a little bit here into the next question, but before we go there full bore, I just wanted to come back to Mr. Fong and put a question to you again as a Chinese investor, not necessarily representing CNOOC, but as a Chinese investor. What do you think? How will Chinese companies now approach the Canadian investment scene in light of the Nixon decision? And what is this going to mean? Is it going to keep interest up in investment? Can we continue to see high degree of Chinese interest in investment? What will the approaches be of Chinese companies in light of the Nixon decision?
Well, okay.
Perhaps I should say not the Nixon decision, but the accompanying decision that came with it with respect to investment in the oil sands.
In general terms, I think I should more speak in the context of the Nixon acquisition. And we, at least, I think CNOOC Limited, just like many other commercial organizations, would have to operate under a set of commercial principles. And in terms of investment in a country like Canada or anywhere outside of China, we always follow this concept of reserve, as we are in the extraction industry, reward, and risk. These are the three critical components that have to be very well balanced. Our view towards Canada, it's always been a very important and strategic investment destination. Needless to say, this country is blessed with vast natural resources, and that gives the basis for reserve, and even more importantly, the growth of a reserve base. The reward, however, has to be long-term. Given the nature, let's say, oil sands, shale gas, those are all capital-intensive opportunities. And we have to look at it on at least quite a few 5-year plans before you really can take a reasonable return, economical return. But to us, the reward is also the accessibility to a growth platform for further development globally. The Nexen example, really, Nexen is a global, international company. Mm-hmm. It's not a pure Canadian company. On risk side, as support, Canada is certainly a place where you could look for security in your investment, for its political stability and the transparency in its physical regimes. And this is especially true when it's supported by a strategic partnership between the two countries. However, on the other hand, ever since I kind of landed in Canada for a number of adventures, I have come to learn this world as social license to operate. And what I would like to say really is, it's not really the origin of the capital that matters. It's the behavior of that capital would really matter. And if an investor doesn't behave well, they induce a risk on themselves, on itself. And there is nobody to blame for it. On the other hand, of course, being Chinese, we do realize that we have a longer journey than the better known or more familiar faces of other investors. It could happen to somebody, everybody will have to earn the social license to operate. Mm-hmm. We probably would have to work harder. And we are well prepared for that. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think you've in fact commented on Hugh's points about what Chinese companies will need to do in light of that, and that's a very positive response. And it certainly gives us a nice lead in now to talk about sort of the broader relationship and wrap up our questions before we turn to the audience. And that really, I'll come back to you, Madeline, if you wouldn't mind talking a bit more maybe about sort of the overall relationship and how do we ensure mutuality of benefit. I mean, what the notion that we get investment from abroad, from foreign companies, including Chinese companies, they get some benefits and so forth. We get the benefit of shipping and being paid for the product to markets like China and so on. But can that mutuality of benefit be broadened and widened, and so that, to go to Mr. Fang's point, that there is a strategic approach to this? It's not just a question of barter or trade, that we really are looking at, and I think what this conference is looking at, how can we create a relationship that is multifaceted, that is long-lasting, and is more than simply a transactional relationship.
Well, certainly, but we have to treat it like it's not just a trade and investment relationship. And again, some of the speakers this morning have already touched on these things. It's the connections at the people level. It's the educational connections. I think there was a very good report written by Don Campbell out of BC, and I'm trying to remember who he wrote the report for, where he talked about all these linkages at lower levels that weren't just financial transactions or trade transactions, but were actually looking at the people-to-people links. And those have to be explored as well. But again, it would be nice to do that as part of sort of a better thought-out approach on the part of the government and on the part of the people, actually, than to just sort of do it willy-nilly, ad hoc, little bits and pieces. But there certainly seems to be the appetite for it at the moment, so we'll see.
To what extent, going beyond on that point, is there an opportunity for Canadian, and I'll stick with the oil and gas sector because that's what we're talking about, oil and gas companies to have activities in China over the longer term? You have reserves of your own that need to be developed and so forth. We have technologies and companies that could help you do that. Again, I'm going to turn to you, Mr. Feng, as sort of the Chinese representative on the panel. Do you see benefits? The part of this relationship in this sector could well include Canadian companies operating in China.
Many of you might have been informed that China National Offshore Oil Corporation was indeed one of the milestones of China's open up and reform policy. As it came into existence 30 years ago with the exclusive right to cooperate with international oil companies offshore China. And offshore China has been home to many foreign direct investments. I mean, offshore oil and gas sector has been home to many foreign direct investments from all over the world for the last 30 years. There were 186 production sharing contracts signed and executed between China National Offshore Oil Corporation and its foreign partners. There are quite a few actually originated from Canada. Among them, Husky Oil, Ranger, and Husky was one of the early success examples in deep water China as well. So there are involvements of Canadian firms in the Chinese oil industry. But we are not seen as active a participation of the Canadian energy sector in the Chinese industries as compared with, say, the US firms or firms from Europe. Perhaps you are more content with your own resources already. But sure, there are opportunities, and we will be very happy to be the bridge for the two business communities in general.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to the floor very quickly. Greg, one last comment, and then we'll take some. So if you want to start lining up the microphones, I'm sure you have a few questions.
To add to that, in addition to just the direct investment that can happen, and there's some shale gas opportunities down there that others are involved in on the multinational level, the one that we've seen that from our sector has kind of moved down from there is also in the services and technology area. And it's not just pure technology, the patents and the science, it's the know-how. The Alberta China Petroleum Training Center, for example, has opened up the opportunity for many of our service sector who have invented the hydraulic fracturing that can open up shale gas and other things as well, who've invented energy efficiency and environmental. I was over at a trade show in China and actually in there and looking at all the competition out there, and I said to one of the small, very small Canadian service companies on the environmental side, how can you compete here? And she, the president of the company, said back to me, it's because we can innovate on the environmental side of things, and that's what they want, is that innovation that's coming out of there. So while it's not as robust as it is perhaps in other countries, and perhaps we do have enough resource for the production to be able to be focused on here, the service sector, in particular on that side, has a very good opportunity there as well.
Oh, by the way, CNOOC Limited is going to be soon listed in Toronto Stock Exchange. So the ordinary Canadians would have an opportunity to invest in CNOOC as well.
Including everybody in this room,
yeah.
Right? All right, now, so we'd like to move to the floor and take a few questions. We have about 15 minutes before I know you're all hungry and waiting for lunch. John Higginbotham.
Hi. This is a question addressed to Mr. Fang, and I'd like him to put on his long-term view of the Chinese petroleum market and who it imports from and where the sources of domestic supply come from. I'm particularly interested in developments that seem to be taking place between China and Russia in respect of oil supply to China. The president of China on his first official visit is going to Moscow first, which is quite remarkable compared with other first foreign visits of Chinese leaders. And there have been reports of important new deals between China and Rosneft, the big Russian state-owned oil exporter, and also reports that one of the topics for discussion on the president's visit to Moscow will be Chinese participation in the Arctic oil plays that are going on in Soviet Siberia. I just wondered if you, looking to the future, is the window of opportunity still open for Canada in oil? Things take a long time in Canada, unfortunately. There's a lot of politics and a lot of regulatory issues involved. Some of those may not occur in the, say, between China and Russia. So I just wondered if you'd comment on where you see China meeting its supply needs globally over the future, Africa, Russia, etc. Canada is facing that competition. And also domestically, whether China sees particular opportunities in tight oil and tight gas once the technology is clear.
Again, I would like to emphasize that as an industry practitioner, we tend to look at a bunch of markets rather than just focusing on a country market like China. I would emphasize my point previously that there are almost half of the world's population striving for industrialization, and there is surely going to be a huge demand growth. With that growth, the world is going to catch up with supply from a large number of different suppliers, but also with technological improvements, technological advance. That's the only way that could catch up. But being Chinese, I would like to think that we have a diversified supply, sources of energy supply. And the window of opportunity for Canada surely is open. For how long? Well, there are competitions, right? And competition is the least predictable because of the diversity of your competition.
Thank you. Another questioner, please give your name, please.
Yeah. My name is Chang. I'm from Canada China Chamber of Commerce. CCC was just founded last year. Our members are Chinese company already invest here. So here, you know, as I know, our members try very hard to become a responsible investor here in Canada. And I have two questions. First question, what kind of issues Chinese investors should pay attention to when they invest in Canada? And another question is, what kind of measures they should take to try to integrate into the local community and become a local citizenship company here? Thank you.
Well, there are two obvious persons to answer that. Maybe what I will do is I'll start with you, because I know you've given some thought to that, and give you a chance maybe to think a little more Mr. Fong, before you have to reply to that, because we've already partly replied to that question, I think. Hugh.
Well, it's a very good question, and of course it goes well beyond the oil industry. And I think, as Mr. Fong said, it's not where the capital comes from, but how the capital behaves. And so there'll be more and more Chinese companies coming into this country in various sectors. And it's probably not rocket science. I mean, basically, you have to act as a good corporate citizen. You need to establish local connections. Whichever community the company is established in, it will develop relationships with its municipality, with its provincial officials. If it's a reasonable sized company, one would hope that it would get involved in various community relations, CSR type activities. These could be as simple as the sort of things that Tim Hortons does to sponsor local hockey teams, or much broader kind of CSR activities. I think another way, frankly, is that some of these Chinese companies no doubt will bring in Chinese executives, and as these executives come into the community and become integrated and send their kids to school and so forth, you develop the very important personal connections that take place. So it's not just some big company that's come in, it's people that have come in, and people develop the kind of knowledge and remove the fear. I think it's the familiarity and localization that will remove this irrational fear. So I think there's a range of things that companies need to do. Just to come back to the HD mining case, I think another good example, of course, is to be very aware of the regulatory environment in which you operate. One false step could be used against you. Maybe these companies won't have the kind of leeway that some others will, and so, you know, if they're going to be union issues or whatever, you better figure them out ahead of time and make sure that there's good PR. One example that is given quite often is the entry of Japanese companies into the North American market in the 1990s, where there was great fear of Japan. Japan was going to take over the world and so forth. And these companies have localized very, very successfully. So, you know, if you look at the Toyota plant down in Cambridge, Ontario, it acts, walks, and talks like a local company. Canadians are proud of the fact that these vehicles are made in Canada. The Japanese have really turned this around, and I'm absolutely confident that the Chinese will do the same, or are doing the same, and will continue to do the same.
Mr. Fong, would you like to add anything to?
Well, my only comment is you have to be human in order to blend into the community. But I will come back with an answer only after we've walked our talks. Thank you.
Good point.
Greg?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I mean, we do have 2 years experience that Mr. Fong is leading right into this right now, and has done a very good job with our industry of coming and engaging with that. The 2 years experience we had was with Sinopec when they came in and took the daylight deal. A smaller deal, but they came in, they kept the executive team, they brought some people in to augment that as well. But then their local spending went up. They hired 25% more people. Their budget went from $250 million to $850 million a year. And they're doing the things in the community that are appropriate. But yet you don't hear about that. You hear about the mining ones in the media, but yet they're doing the things that are there. The real captive of that is to then get that assimilated, and the human aspect of it gets shared.
Local procurement involving the supply chains, as was mentioned earlier.
Absolutely.
These are all very important things to do.
I think we have a couple of questions over at this microphone.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
So I'm John from University of Ottawa. It's fourth-year finance student. Just by chance, our class has been covering the CNOOC and Nexen deal extensively over the past few months. I guess the key question that we as students try to answer is not, whether the deal was good or bad, but how Canada will handle future deals like this. I know there is the Investment Canada Act. I mean, the 6, I think, sort of very vague criteria, used to benchmark future deals, but there are no solid measures or benchmarks in that act. And I guess the key question is, what is Canada doing currently that, to deal with sort of what Madeline mentioned earlier? How are they going to handle future deals if they come up, and what are the, what's going on with the policy? I mean, should, a company like Suncor or something becomes a target for a future takeover, what would Canada be, how would they respond?
Would you like to take a crack at that, Madeline?
Okay. Well, to be fair to the federal government, which I'm not always. They did have some guidelines set out in 2007 for state-owned enterprises, which they beefed up or further elaborated, I guess, when they made the announcement on CNOC Nexen. But to be perfectly honest, I think that they will take all of these future bids on a case-by-case basis, and they'll see, you know, is it politically sensitive? They'll sort of gauge the temperature at the time, rather than setting out a more detailed policy that we could all look at, because there doesn't seem to be any appetite for that right now. So it's your guess is as good as mine, like whether the next deal is going to be controversial or not, and that can change, you know, with the day and with the industry. We don't have a very reliable system in place right now.
Do you have any suggestions, going back to your earlier point about a need for a plan and this sort of thing? Does that tie into a broader view that the government should be taking to the development of resources generally?
Well, you know, if you look at some of the more successful resource economies, if you look at Norway, for example, and people always say, oh, we can't compare Norway with Canada, they're a different country, but they did actually do some very deep thinking about where oil was going to place in their economy, and they took a stand on it. They took a position, and they said, well, you know, we want to make sure that there's some government ownership, and the rules are pretty clear there. This is something that's a real anathema in Canada. Nobody wants to touch this because I think, again, it sounds too much like industrial policy, but I think that that would really help clarify things. But it couldn't just come as a government pronouncement. It has to come as after consultations and in cooperation with the provinces. And again, the disincentive there is people are saying, well, there's these opportunities we want to seize on now. We don't have time to do all of this planning and consultation and come up with something that looks like a plan. But if the commodities boom that started in 2003 is really supposed to continue for 3 decades with all the emerging economies and the demand from there, I think there's enough time to take a few years and get it right.
And I would assume that the next point is that the longer-term relationship with China in this sector would be benefited from having such a plan.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's go on to another questioner. Please identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Robin. I'm a student at Carleton University. My question is for Hugh Stevens, I believe. I'd like to thank you for bringing up the issue of Canadian trust for Chinese companies. And I think it's usually these sorts of taboo issues that warrant the most discussion. So my question really is, does it really make sense to chalk up Canadian lack of trust for these companies to just, does it make sense to chalk it up to xenophobia and ignorance and irrational fear when there are plenty of decent reasons to be concerned? Like you have increasing cyber activity, you have human rights issues, Chinese history in their own country with environmental regulation and so on. And all of this coming in the context of federal deregulation, it seems like Canadians have a very good reason to be concerned that these issues might get translated into a Canadian context. So does it really make sense to chalk it up to just ignorance and xenophobia when there are these decent reasons for why the majority of Canadians might be concerned?
Well, I would come back to the point that I made about us being sovereign in our own jurisdiction. I mean, there are a range of issues, obviously, on what's happening in China, as there are a range of issues as to what's happening on gun control in the United States. I mean, there's all kinds of views in the Canadian public. But if it comes to be a question of how you regulate foreign investment in this country, there is a whole panoply of tools that are available to Canadians to be able to do that. And I guess I would contend that if there are issues with perceptions of investment and so forth, then use the tools that are available. Don't invoke some sort of knee-jerk reaction to keep this investment out, but ensure that the investment, in fact, meets net benefit. That's what the net benefit test is all about. That's what CNOC presumably satisfied. And as for the other concerns about, well, will these health and safety standards, what about all the mining accidents in China? Is this going to happen here? Well, I mean, yes, there are mining accidents in China. Yes, it's not a very good record, and you know, this is something the government is presumably working on, but that doesn't mean that it has to happen here. If it happens here, it's because we haven't, frankly, used the tools that are available to ensure that Canadian standards are met.
Let's go on. I think we have time for one more question. Is that Ailish?
Yes, hi, Len.
Hi.
Hi.
Over to you.
Ailish Campbell with the Canadian Council of Chief Executives. First question, I see that the interim, the one-time interim CEO of Nexen has, of course, been confirmed as the CEO. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about where that CEO will fit in your global management table at CNOC. And secondly, I think Hugh and Greg and others put their finger on it in terms of talking about supply chains. And I'm wondering if there's any commentary that any member of the panel may have about the opportunities of the Nexen investment, in fact, for Canadian operators in terms of accessing new, more diverse supply chains, particularly in Asia, via their interactions with Nexen. Thanks.
Thank you, Ailish. I think, Mr. Fong, that's yours to start off, and then we'll ask the other members of the panel before we close if they have any comment.
I think we made it very clear in the outset of the transaction that not only do we value Nexen as a company with a lot of growth opportunities, but also its people. This transaction has been a friendly transaction. On one side, because it got a lot of the majority support from the two sets of board of directors, two sets of management, and two sets of shareholders. But it is friendly also because we've worked together and we know each other. We found out there are so many similarities that we believe together we could be a stronger one. Therefore, we are very pleased to have the whole Nexen's executive leadership team staying on with us as under the leadership of Mr. Kevin Reinhardt. There are, of course, just because of all these cultural differences and even the time differences between Calgary and Beijing that present some challenges. And there will be a grace period. But nothing is insurmountable. And I think even more importantly, we have always looking at this particular transaction as a way for CNOC to grow even more international. And the way we look at it is it could be very well be a two-way integration. We have to learn and share the best practices of both organizations. Does that satisfy your question?
Any other members of the panel want to comment on Ailish's questions at all? Greg?
Sure, I
go
can
ahead.
just speak to a little bit of the supply chain. I mentioned it, but to give some examples of that, I think it does, as Mr. Fong said, open up that integration. That's the real key. We've seen that happen with other companies. We've seen that with the Statoils. We've seen that with the Shells and others of the world as well as they've come into that integration. And what it does from a Canadian perspective is it opens up that window to the global. And I think that's really the transition that perhaps our industry is at the leading edge of. Well, there's others in Canada as well. But as Canada kind of pivots now from being kind of a North American focused country for our export world to a global world, the integration with Chinese companies or others as well opens up for the suppliers those relationships. so that when they bring new innovations and other technologies to the table, not only do they work in Canada, but they also work around the world. Someone mentioned Russia, for example. Well, they come to Canada looking for innovation on cold weather technologies because they're operating their rigs in the same cold weather atmospheres that we're at. Husky, when they went to China, took their offshore technologies from the east coast of Canada and took it with them and when they went over to China as well. And so there is those opportunities that being on this global stage brings both sides. It brings the global attention, but it also brings that global opportunity.
Anyone else here?
Specifically on supply chains, but just by way of sort of wrapping up and summarize some of the comments. I mean, it's my hope that now that the CNOOC-Nexen deal went through, and as far as I can tell, it was a pretty close run thing, and we have to recognize that governments do work in a political context and a public context, and maybe the government was only able to go as far as it did by approving this one and saying, but you know, for the time being, barring special circumstances, no more. But this event, this transaction having gone through, I'm convinced will show us that the sky didn't fall, that in fact some of the benefits that you're talking about, Greg and Mr. Fung, are going to take place. And you know, potentially down the road, Madeline was saying, you know, case by case, we'll see. I mean, certainly I'm sure there will be more minority investment from Chinese companies and state-owned companies, you know, but maybe as we go forward, as we learn, as frankly the kind of discussion and dialogue we're having in this room gets more widely available in the broader media, you know, we'll be able to develop that cooperation and partnership to our mutual benefit.
Well, thank you, Hugh. Unless you want to have a final word, Madeline, I'd just like to say thank you to the panel. I think we've had a very good panel here, and I expect that you're going to get called to lunch, but thank you again.